There is a particular kind of humiliation that comes wrapped in legal language. It arrives in sealed envelopes and sits across conference tables in mahogany rooms, and it sounds like a man in a good suit reading the words your father chose over you from a document he signed while still breathing. Nora Calloway-Marsh learned that kind of humiliation on a Thursday in November in a lawyer's office that smelled like leather polish and old money, while her two brothers sat across from her in shirts that cost more than her monthly rent, and tried very hard not to smile. But we are not there yet. Before the lawyer's office, there was the apartment on Decatur Street in Staunton, Virginia. Second floor, 3 rooms, a window that faced a brick wall, and a bathroom faucet that dripped in 3/4 time like a metronome counting down to something she could not name. Nora had lived there for 2 years, since the divorce, since Marcus had taken the house and the car and most of the savings account and a good portion of whatever confidence she had left. She was 39 years old. She worked Monday through Saturday at a dry cleaner and alterations shop on Market Street called Hales, pressing other people's wedding dresses and hemming other people's dress pants for $11 an hour, plus whatever tips the counter produced, which in a slow week amounted to enough for a fast food dinner and a lottery ticket she never won. She had one daughter, Lily, who was 10 years old and had her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn jaw, and the peculiar resilience that children develop when they understand, without being told, that money is a word that causes the adults around them to go very quiet and very still. On the morning of November 4th, Nora was ironing the pleats on a man's dress shirt and listening to Lily do multiplication tables at the small kitchen table in the back room that she had claimed as a homework space, when her phone rang with a number she recognized as belonging to Gareth. Her older brother had not called her in 11 months. The last time had been Thanksgiving of the previous year, and that call had lasted 4 minutes and covered the subjects of their father's declining health, the property taxes on the Calloway estate, and whether Nora intended to contribute financially to anything related to either topic. She had said she was barely keeping her head above water. Gareth had said that was unfortunate. They had not spoken since. She answered on the 3rd ring. Gareth's voice came through flat and formal, the way it always did when he was delivering information rather than making conversation. Dad passed this morning, 8:47. The hospice nurse was with him. It was quiet at the end. Nora set down the iron. She stood in the hissing steam of someone else's collar and pressed her free hand flat against the ironing board and waited for whatever she expected to feel to arrive. It took longer than it should have. "I'm sorry," she said, because there was nothing else to say. Gareth said the funeral arrangements had already been started, and he and Philip had handled it. The reading of the will was set for the following Thursday, the lawyer's office in Charlottesville. He would send her the address. She should be there at 2 o'clock. He hung up before she could ask anything else. Lily appeared in the doorway of the back room with a pencil behind her ear and the particular stillness children inhabit when they have heard something they are trying to understand. "Was that Uncle Gareth?" "Yes, baby. Is Grandpa Edgar gone?" "Yes." Lily came to her mother without being asked and pressed her face against Nora's side, and Nora put one hand on her daughter's shoulder and kept the other flat on the ironing board because she needed something solid beneath her palm while the world rearranged itself into its new configuration. Edgar Calloway had not been a warm man. He had been a precise one. He loved the land the way some men love mathematics, with a devotion that was more about order than feeling. The Calloway estate sat on 340 acres of Shenandoah Valley farmland outside the small town of Waynesboro, and Edgar had tended it the way his father had and his grandfather before that, with the religious consistency of someone who believed that the stewardship of a place was the highest calling a man could answer. He had 3 children. Gareth came first, by 15 months, then Philip, and then 4 years later, Nora. She had always understood, without the understanding ever being spoken aloud, that she occupied a different position in her father's emotional architecture than her brothers did. It was not cruelty, exactly. Edgar Calloway did not have the imagination for cruelty. It was more like she had arrived at a point in his life when his attention was already fully allocated, when the shape of his love had already hardened into forms that fit her brothers, the way good boots fit feet that have worn them for years. Her mother, Patricia, had understood this and compensated for it in the quiet, strategic way that mothers do, filling the gaps with extra attention and small conspiracies of kindness that Nora had not fully appreciated until Patricia was gone. Breast cancer, when Nora was 22. After that, there was only Edgar, and Edgar and Nora had maintained a relationship that was cordial and careful and never quite reached the temperature of warm. When she married Marcus Marsh at 28, Edgar had attended the wedding, shaken the groom's hand with appropriate firmness, danced once with the bride, and presented them with an envelope containing a check for $5,000, the same amount he had given Gareth and Phillip at their weddings. Equitable. Precise. When the marriage ended a decade later, Nora had not told her father for 3 months. When she finally called him, he had been quiet for a long time, and then said that he was sorry to hear it, and that she should let him know if there was anything he could do. And she had said, "Thank you." There was nothing, and they had both known that was the truth. There was nothing he could do that he was equipped to do. She had not been to the estate in 2 years. The reading of the will was held in the offices of Aldous and Crane, attorneys at law, while on the 4th floor of a building in downtown Charlottesville that had been designed to communicate permanence and prosperity and the general rightness of existing arrangements. Warren Aldous was a man of 62, with silver hair swept back from a wide forehead and eyes the color of old pewter that never quite settled on anything long enough to suggest he was listening rather than calculating. Gareth and Phillip were already seated when Nora arrived. Gareth was the oldest at 44, broad-shouldered and prosperously built, with their father's jaw and none of their mother's softness. He ran a commercial agriculture consulting firm in Harrisonburg and wore his success with the ease of someone who has never seriously considered the possibility of failure. Phillip was 3 years behind him, thinner and quicker, a real estate developer in Richmond who had the habit of looking at the middle distance when you spoke to him, as though he was calculating something more interesting than your actual words. There was a 4th person in the room, a woman Nora did not recognize, perhaps 60, with reading glasses pushed up into steel gray hair and a small leather notebook open on her knee. She introduced herself as Constance Whitmore, representing the estate's accounting interests. She smiled at Nora, with something that might have been sympathy. Aldous read for 40 minutes. The estate was large in both acreage and complexity, and Edgar had been thorough in a way that suggested he had spent considerable time organizing this final act of his life. The farmland went to Gareth and Phillip in equal shares, to be managed jointly or divided by mutual agreement within a period of 18 months. The house and its contents were similarly divided: the equipment, the vehicles, the accounts, the timber rights on the northern 40 acres, the orchards, the rental income from the tenant cottage on the South Road. It was all precise and clear and exactly what Nora had expected. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and her face composed in an expression of careful neutrality, the kind she had learned to produce in the years since Marcus had sat across a different table and distributed their shared life in similar fashion. And then Aldous turned a page and said, "To my daughter, Nora Patricia Calloway-Marsh, I bequeath the parcel of land at the eastern boundary of the Calloway estate, comprising 0.8 acres surrounding and including the stone Dovecote structure. This parcel is described in Attachment C as the Eastfield parcel. It is conveyed with full deed rights, but without access to the main drive, access being by the existing fire lane along the eastern fence line. He put the paper down. He looked up. He said, "That concludes the primary bequests." The room held its breath for exactly 1 second. Then Gareth laughed. It was not a cruel sound, which was almost worse. It was the sound of someone encountering an outcome that was simultaneously surprising and, upon reflection, entirely predictable. He pressed his thumb and forefinger to the bridge of his nose in the gesture of a man trying to contain an emotion too large for the room, and then he looked at Philip, and Philip made a sound in the back of his throat that was not quite a laugh, but was not one either. "The Dovecote," Gareth said. "He's leaving you the Dovecote." Nora kept her hands folded and her face quiet. Philip turned to her with an expression of practiced concern. "Nora, that thing is falling apart. The roof on the bird chamber has been gone since the storm in 2019. Half the walls are covered in vines. I am not sure you can even get to it in a vehicle. The fire lane hasn't been maintained in years." He paused. "Dad probably just wanted to make sure you got something." He was trying to be fair. "It's 0.8 acres, Gareth said. He had recovered his equanimity. He spoke now with the measured reasonableness of a man who wanted to be on record as having been gracious. "I am sure we can work something out. Perhaps we can purchase it from you at fair market value. Given the condition of the structure and the access limitations, I would estimate the parcel at around $12,000 or $15,000. That would at least give you something useful." Nora looked at Warren Aldous. She said, "Is there anything else I need to sign today?" "Just the acknowledgement of receipt," Aldous said. His pewter eyes held something she could not quite read. She signed the paper. She stood. She thanked him by name. She did not look at her brothers again as she walked out of the mahogany room and through the reception area and down 4 floors in the elevator to the parking garage, where her 10-year-old Honda Civic sat between a BMW and an Audi, like a punchline to a joke she was tired of telling. She sat in the driver's seat for 6 minutes. She did not cry, when she had learned in the past several years that crying required a kind of stillness that she could rarely afford. And when she could afford it, it never came. She started the car and drove back to Staunton. That evening, she sat at the kitchen table after Lily was asleep and opened her laptop and searched for information on 0.8-acre parcels in Augusta County, Virginia. She searched for historical dovecotes in the Shenandoah Valley. She searched for the records on the Eastfield parcel and found a county survey document that described it as unimproved agricultural land with a non-functional historic outbuilding, zoned A2, assessed value $9,000. $9,000. For $11 an hour and tips, that was roughly 10 months of gross income. She stared at the survey document for a long time. Then she looked at her phone. She had 3 missed texts from Gareth sent in the 2 hours since the reading, each one progressively increasing in reasonableness, starting at 15,000 and arriving, by the 3rd message, at 22. 5. Please consider, Nora. It makes no practical sense for you to hold on to this. There is nothing there. Let us help you. She put the phone face down on the table. The dovecote was hers. She had seen it perhaps a dozen times over the course of her life, always at a distance, always at the edge of the estate's eastern field, where the property line met the beginnings of the tree line. It was not the kind of structure you visited intentionally. It sat at the far end of a long, poorly drained field, accessible by the fire lane her father had kept open primarily for the benefit of the forestry department that managed the timber on the north parcel. As a child, she had sometimes walked to it across the field in summer, the grass high against her shins, the structure growing larger as she approached until it revealed itself to be more substantial than it appeared from the house. It was built of gray limestone, the kind quarried from the western hills in the mid-1800s, with walls nearly 2 feet thick at the base. The main chamber rose to perhaps 18 feet, at the peak of what had once been a conical roof. The interior lined with hundreds of small nesting alcoves carved directly into the stone, and each one precisely measured and spaced with the kind of obsessive craft that the 19th century brought to things it considered worth doing properly. Above the main chamber, the bird loft had been enclosed in timber, framing that had not survived the 2019 storm, and its wreckage had collapsed partially into the loft space and partially outward onto the ground, where it had been slowly absorbed by the vegetation. But the stone itself was intact. Walls 2 feet thick and 140 years old do not fall to one storm. The limestone base, which Nora had never paid close attention to, was actually 2 structures in one. The visible dovecote, and beneath it, a foundation that was considerably older. Something about the stonework changed at roughly 4 feet above the ground level. Above that line was the precise, mortared limestone of the 1880s. Below it, the stone was different, rougher, larger, set in patterns that did not quite match any masonry style she had a name for. She would not understand what that meant for another 3 weeks. Nora drove out to the property on the Saturday after the funeral. She brought Lily, who had attended the funeral, with the somber composure of a child who understood that grief was one of the things adults needed from the people around them, and who had stood beside her mother through the graveside service and the reception at the estate house without complaint, eating a small plate of funeral sandwiches and answering questions about 4th grade with the polite brevity of someone who had more interesting things to think about. The fire lane access was at the far end of the county road that ran along the property's eastern edge. Nora turned in between 2 rusted metal posts that had once held a gate, drove slowly along the overgrown 2-track through a 1/4 mile of scrub maple and cedar until the trees thinned and she could see across the eastern field toward the tree line. The dovecote sat exactly as she remembered it, and also completely differently, because the last time she had seen it, she had been someone's wife and someone's daughter, and had no particular stake in the outcome of its existence. Now it was hers. Lily got out of the car and stood in the November grass with her hands in her pockets, looking across the field. The sky was the pale gray of late autumn, the kind of sky that holds light without releasing it, and the limestone walls of the dovecote had gone the color of old bone in that flat, even illumination. "It looks like something from a story," Lily said. "What kind of story?" Her daughter considered this with the seriousness she brought to all questions of category, the kind where something important is hidden inside. They walked across the field through grass that had gone dormant and brown, their feet making a soft, crushing sound with each step, the dovecote growing larger as they approached until it was filling Nora's field of view, and she was standing close enough to put her hand on the stone. She put her hand on the stone. It was cold in the way that things are cold when they have been cold for a very long time, when the cold has settled into the material so completely that no amount of October sunlight can reach the center of it. The limestone was rough under her palm, pitted and textured, covered in patches of silver-green lichen that had been growing there longer than she had been alive. The door was on the south face, a low-arched opening fitted with what remained of a wooden door that had lost 2 of its 3 hinges, and now stood at a diagonal, admitting a wedge of gray light to the interior. Nora pulled it open enough to step through. Inside, the smell was of stone and old water, and the particular mineral cold of places that never see direct sun. The nesting alcoves rose around her in rows, hundreds of them, empty for decades, their interiors dark and small, each one a precisely cut pocket in the limestone that had once sheltered a bird and now sheltered nothing. The floor was flagstone, uneven, scattered with debris from the collapsed roof structure. Timber joists had fallen in a rough diagonal across the center of the space, gray with age, the wood soft with years of moisture exposure. Lily stood in the doorway looking up. "How many nests are there?" Nora counted a section and did the math. "Maybe 400. "That's a lot of birds. It was used for food. They kept doves and pigeons for the table, and eggs. It was common on big estates in the old days." Lily turned to look at the floor, then at the walls near the base, where the stone changed. She walked to the nearest wall and crouched down, pressing her small hand against the lower courses. "These stones are different from the ones up there." Nora crouched beside her. In the interior light, the distinction was clearer than it had been from outside. The upper courses, from about 4 feet upward, were the uniform limestone of the 1880s, square cut and mortared in regular horizontal rows. Below that, the stone was a different color entirely, darker, almost charcoal gray, and the pieces were larger and more irregular, set without mortar in an interlocking pattern that Nora did not have vocabulary for, but that her eye registered as being considerably older. Much older. "Some of these don't even look like quarried stone," Lily said. "They look like they were pulled out of a field." Nora stood up and looked around at the full circumference of the interior at ground level. The transition line was consistent all the way around. Whoever had built the Dovecote in the 1880s had built it on top of something that already existed. The limestone chamber rose from a foundation that wasn't limestone at all, that was a different stone from a different time, set in a different hand. She pulled out her phone and took photographs. The transition line, the stonework patterns, the floor where the flagstones in the center were slightly raised, as though the ground beneath them had shifted. When she stepped outside and walked around the perimeter, she could see it from the exterior too, now that she was looking. The building sat on a circular base of darker stone that extended perhaps 8 inches beyond the 1880s limestone in all directions. It was buried in the ground, mostly, but the top courses of it were visible at ground level, peeking out beneath the limestone, like the hem of an older garment. She stood in the November grass and looked at this, and did not yet know what she was looking at. But she felt something, the way you feel when a locked door is closer than you realized. The nearest house to the Dovecote was not on the Calloway estate proper, but on the neighboring parcel, a small farm that fronted the county road a 1/4 mile north. A hand-painted sign at the gate read, "Price," and a gravel drive led to a white farmhouse with green shutters and a covered porch lined with clay pots that held the remnants of summer herbs. A truck in the driveway was old enough to have a bench seat. Nora had not intended to knock on a stranger's door. She had intended to drive back out the fire lane and go home to Staunton and process the day in whatever way she was going to process it. But Lily had spotted the farmhouse from the road and said simply, "Someone lives there," as though this were both obvious and significant, and Nora had turned in without entirely deciding to. Well, the woman who answered the door was 73 and carried herself like someone who had spent those years doing actual physical work, which was confirmed by the state of her hands, which were strong and calloused in a way that Nora associated with people who did not hire other people to do things they could do themselves. She had white hair, pulled back without ceremony, and blue eyes that evaluated Nora in the first 3 seconds, with the frank efficiency of someone who did not have time for performances. "I'm Nora Calloway-Marsh," Nora said. "Edgar Calloway's daughter. My father just passed. I've inherited the piece of property with the old Dovecote. I was out looking at it, and I saw your farm, and I thought someone nearby might know something about the history of the place." The woman, who introduced herself as Helen Price. I opened the door wider without visible hesitation. "Come in out of the cold. I'll make coffee." Lily sat at Helen's kitchen table with a glass of milk and the kind of comfortable immediacy children achieve in kitchens that feel like kitchens are supposed to feel, warm and slightly cluttered, smelling of something baked earlier in the day. Helen put coffee in front of Nora without asking whether she wanted it, and then sat down across from her and folded her hands on the table. "That dovecote has been on my horizon my whole life," Helen said. "Born in this house, grew up looking at it across that field. My grandmother knew your great-grandmother. The Calloway and Price families have been neighbors since before I was born." "Do you know anything about the history of the building itself?" Nora asked. Helen considered this. "The stone building that's there now was built by your great-great-grandfather, James Calloway. He built it in 1887, when he was establishing the estate. James was a prosperous man by then. He had made money in several ventures over the years, not farming primarily, though he farmed. He had interests in commerce, trading, some manufacturing in Staunton. People said he was a careful man with money. Very careful. The kind of careful that comes from having lost it at least once and not wanting to experience that again." Nora wrapped her hands around the coffee mug. "What did he build it on?" Helen looked at her steadily. "What do you mean?" "The foundation of the dovecote. The stone at the base. It's different. Much older." Helen's expression shifted in a way that was not surprise exactly. More like recognition. "Fawn, you noticed that quickly," she said. "What is it?" She was quiet for a moment. "My grandmother told me this, and her grandmother told her. So you understand, this is old family knowledge, which means it is partly history and partly story, and it is sometimes difficult to know where one ends and the other begins. Tell me what you know." Helen looked at the window, at the field visible beyond the glass, at the distant shape of the dovecote against the gray sky. Before James Calloway built that structure, there was already something on that spot, a much older foundation. Stone laid, circular, low to the ground, probably pre-colonial, possibly quite a lot older than that. My grandmother said the local people, the families who had farmed this valley before the Calloways arrived, believed the site was significant in some way. A meeting place, possibly, or a storage site. The kind of thing people built to last because they intended to come back to it. James built his dovecote directly on top of it. He was a practical man. He saw a good foundation, and he used it rather than clearing it. Nora thought about the interior of the dovecote, about the flagstone floor with its slight unevenness at the center. Is there anything beneath the floor? Helen looked at her again, with that expression that was not quite surprise. Why do you ask that? Because the floor doesn't sit right in the middle. There's something under it. I could feel it. A long silence. Outside, a crow called twice from somewhere near the tree line. My grandmother said, Helen began, and her voice had shifted into a register that Nora recognized as the voice people use when they are recounting something they take seriously, that James Calloway was a man who had seen the panic of 1873 and the depression that followed, and that a man who watched banks close and paper money become worthless came to have a particular relationship with the question of what kept its value when everything else failed. She said that toward the end of his life, James talked about having made himself secure, not comfortable, secure. The way he said it made it sound like more than a figure of speech. Nora felt her hands go still around the mug. He died in 1912, Helen said. His son inherited the estate, and his son after that, and so on. Whatever James meant by secure, if he meant anything at all, beyond ordinary prosperity. It seems like no one after him ever knew about it. Or, if they knew, they never spoke of it. There was a silence. Lily said, from her end of the table, "That's where it's hidden." Both women looked at her. She was sitting with her milk glass held in both hands and her dark eyes steady and certain. In the floor of the Dovecote. "That's where he put it." "Lily," Nora said. "It makes sense," her daughter said, with the infuriating reasonableness of a 10-year-old who has followed the logic of a situation to its conclusion while the adults were still assembling the pieces. He built on an old foundation, so there was already a hidden space. He put the floor over it. Nobody looks in the floor. Nobody has looked in that floor in 100 years. Helen Price looked at Lily for a long moment, with an expression Nora could not categorize. Then she looked at Nora. "Your daughter," she said, "is either going to be a detective or an archaeologist." "Or both," Lily said. The weeks that followed were not glamorous. There was the question of the fire lane, which had to be brought to a usable condition before Nora could do much of anything practical on the property. She called 2 contractors, both of whom quoted numbers that made her stomach drop. And then she called a third, a man named Owen McAllister, who ran a 1-person operation out of a truck that was older than his business, and who quoted her a number that was still significant but not catastrophic, and who had the additional advantage of having grown up in the county and knowing exactly what the fire lane situation looked like and what it would take to fix it. He was 51, with a stonemason's hands and a face that had been outdoors for 30 years. And when Nora explained what she had inherited and what she intended to do with it, which was primarily to make the structure safe enough to investigate properly, he had walked out to the Dovecote with her and stood inside and looked at the walls for a long time. "That's nice stonework," he said finally, "of the upper limestone." Then he crouched down and looked at the base courses, and he was quiet for a longer time. "This is something else entirely," he said. "Can you identify it?" He ran his fingers along the joints, which were tight and precise, and used no mortar that he could find. "Dry-laid stone," he said, "and not just any dry-laid. Whoever built this knew what they were doing. These aren't just stacked, they're fitted. Every stone chosen for its neighbors." He stood and looked around at the full circle of the base. He said, "This is load-bearing construction. Whatever is under this floor, these walls were built to hold weight above it for a very long time." "What do you mean?" He looked at the floor, then at her. "I mean, this wasn't built as a foundation to be built on top of. It was built as a container." Nora stood in the cold interior of the Dovecote and felt the word settle into her. A container. That night she called Gareth, not because she wanted to, but because there was a practical matter that required addressing. Under the terms of the will and the survey attached to the deed, the Eastfield parcel's exact boundary ran along the outer face of the Dovecote's limestone wall. Gareth and Phillip's estate share began 4 feet beyond that outer wall, which meant that any investigation of the structure itself, including the foundation, was entirely within her property rights and required no permission from anyone. She did not tell Gareth this. She called to ask, with careful neutrality, whether there were any existing surveys or historical records of the Eastfield parcel in the estate's files that she should be aware of, any encumbrances or easements that might affect the property. Gareth was briefly and apparently sincerely surprised that she was calling. "Nora," he said, "I told you, we can make you an offer. There is genuinely nothing there for you. I am not saying this to be unkind. I am saying it because I do not want you spending time and energy on something that isn't going to amount to anything. She said she appreciated his concern and asked again about the survey records. He said he didn't know of any beyond what was in the deed. He said the Dovecote had always just been there. Nobody had paid it any particular attention in his lifetime. She thanked him and ended the call. She sat at the kitchen table with her laptop and her notes from the day and thought about James Calloway, who had been a careful man, a very careful man, the kind of careful that comes from having lost it at least once, who had built a limestone dovecote in 1887 on top of a foundation that was already there, a dry stone circular structure that a professional stonemason had identified as a container designed to hold weight for a long time, who had died in 1912, having made himself, in his own words, secure. She thought about the flagstone floor with its uneven center. She thought about Helen Price's account of a man who understood what kept its value when everything else failed. She thought about the 400 empty nesting alcoves in the walls above, all those small dark pockets lined up in rows, all of them empty. She thought about her brothers in the mahogany room and the way Gareth's laugh had sounded when the lawyer read the word, Dovecote. She thought about Lily saying, "That's where it's hidden," with the calm certainty of a child who had not yet learned the habit of talking herself out of the obvious answer. She closed the laptop and turned off the kitchen light and lay in bed in the apartment on Decatur Street, listening to the faucet drip in three-quarter time. And she thought about a man who had built a wall around his most important thing, and then built another wall on top of that wall, and then put a building on top of that, and waited, with the patience of someone who had no particular confidence in the future, for the right person to come looking. Whether she was the right person remained to be seen, but she was the person who had been given the thing. And for the first time since she had sat in the driver's seat of her Honda Civic in the parking garage in Charlottesville and felt the full weight of her father's careful accounting press down on her, she did not feel like someone who had been handed a consolation prize. She felt like someone standing at the beginning of something. She did not know yet what it cost to be that person. She did not know about the letter that Warren Aldous had drafted and not yet sent, or about the conversation her brothers had held the evening after the reading over glasses of bourbon in the estate's main sitting room, or about the fact that the fire lane she needed to access her property crossed, by a margin of approximately 6 feet, a section of ground that Gareth was already planning to have surveyed, when she did not know about the county assessor's office and the question of the zoning reclassification that was already in preliminary discussion, or about the structural engineer Phillip had called, a man who owed Phillip a professional favor, who had agreed to evaluate the Dovecote on Phillip's behalf and confirm that it constituted a public safety hazard requiring demolition. She did not know any of that yet. All she knew was the cold stone under her hand and the sound of her daughter's voice saying, "That's where it's hidden," and the particular quality of silence that exists in a place where something important has been waiting for a very long time. Owen McAllister started work on the fire lane the following Monday. He brought a truck and a load of gravel and spent 3 days clearing the overgrowth from the 2-track and laying down material in the worst sections. Nora went out on the second day to check the progress and found him standing at the edge of the field, looking at the Dovecote with the expression of a man whose professional instincts have been engaged by something he cannot quite name. "I keep thinking about those base stones," he said, when she walked up beside him. "Have you ever seen stonework like that in this area?" He thought about it. There's some fieldstone construction from the early settlement period that has that kind of dry-laid quality, but not that precise, not that intentional. He paused. There are accounts from the colonial period of finding earlier structures on this side of the valley, older than the English settlements. Some people put them down to Native American construction, some to earlier European contact. Most of them were disassembled for building material or just plowed under. He looked at her. You don't often see one that survived. Is it possible James Calloway knew what he was building on? McAllister nodded slowly. More than possible. A man who was going to put a substantial building on a foundation would want to know what that foundation was capable of. He would have had it inspected, maybe had someone look at the history of the site. If there was a structure there, he knew about it. Then he built specifically on top of it. On purpose. McAllister said this as though it was the obvious conclusion to the conversation because it was. Nora looked across the field at the Dovecote in the pale November light. The gray walls and the darker base, and the collapsed timber of the ruined roof, and all those empty alcoves inside. All those small, dark pockets designed to shelter something small and living. And below them, the flagstone floor. And below that, whatever James Calloway had decided to make secure against time and uncertainty, and the particular vulnerability of a man who had learned the hard way that the structures he trusted could fail. She asked McAllister if he could clear the debris from the collapsed roof structure inside, make the space safe enough to work in without the risk of further collapse. He said he could do that. She asked him, when that was done, whether he would be willing to lift a few of the flagstones in the floor. He looked at her for a moment. Just to see what's under them, she said. He nodded, for with the deliberateness of a man who has lived long enough to understand when a question is not quite the question being asked. I can do that too, he said. They started on the interior the following week. McAllister worked with a care that surprised her, moving the collapsed timber in sections rather than wholesale, treating each piece as something that might matter before deciding it did not. Lily came on the Saturday in her school boots and an old coat that had been Nora's in her 20s, and appointed herself the person responsible for carrying smaller pieces of debris to the pile McAllister was building outside. The work revealed the interior of the Dovecote more completely than Nora had seen it on her first visit. Without the fallen timber across the center, the space was larger than it had appeared, or perhaps 20 feet in diameter, the nesting alcoves rising in their precise rows all the way to the circular opening at the top, where the loft had once been enclosed and where now the sky was visible, gray and cold and exact. The flagstone floor was revealed completely. 11 large stones, irregular in shape, but fitted together with the same deliberate precision as the base courses of the older foundation below. Nora crouched and ran her fingers along the joints between them. They had been set without mortar, like the base courses. They could be lifted. The center stone was different from the others. Larger, roughly circular, with a slight depression in its surface that she had not noticed before. A depression that was not accidental, that had been shaped by tool or by hand, forming a shallow oval in the upper surface of the stone, about the size of a spread palm. Lily crouched beside her and put her hand in the depression. That's a handhold, Lily said. Yes, Nora said. It is. McAllister came and stood over them. He looked at the stone, at the handhold, at the joints around it. He got down on one knee and produced a thin steel tool from his belt and worked it into the joint on the far side of the center stone. He moved it carefully along the full length of the joint, testing. There's no sealant, he said. No mortar, no lime. These have just been sitting here. For how long? He looked up at her. Based on the lichen and the oxidation on the surface? He paused. Long enough. He looked at the handhold again. You want me to lift it? Nora looked at her daughter. Lily was looking at the stone with an expression of absolute attention. The expression she got when she was reading a book at the part where everything was about to change. Nora looked at the center stone and thought about James Calloway in 1887, and about a foundation built as a container, and about a careful man who had made himself secure, and about the 136 years that had passed since someone had last put their hand in that depression and pulled. "Yes," she said. "Lift it." McAllister set his tool and braced himself and put both hands on the stone's upper surface, fingers finding the shape depression. He pulled. The stone came up slowly, with the resistance of something that has not moved in a very long time, and then with a grinding release as the fitted edges broke their contact. And then it was free, and McAllister was lowering it to the side of the space, and all three of them were looking at what was beneath it. A shaft. Circular, perhaps 2 feet in diameter, lined in the same dark, dry-laid stone as the base courses, going down into the earth beneath the Dovecote floor. The darkness in it was complete and still, and from it rose an air that was neither warm nor cold exactly, but the particular temperature of places that have been sealed away from weather and season and time. McAllister took out a flashlight and pointed it into the shaft. The light went down 8 feet before hitting the bottom. And what was on the bottom of that shaft wasn't earth. Nora's hands were shaking as she took the flashlight from McAllister and held it steady and looked at what James Calloway had lowered into the dark beneath his Dovecote floor in 1887 and sealed against the world with a fitted stone, and the patience of a man who understood that the most secure place for the thing you valued most was the place where no one knew to look. What she saw was the beginning of an answer to a question she had barely known she was asking. But the beginning was enough. The beginning was more than enough. She knelt on the flagstone floor of the Dovecote in the November cold, with the flashlight in her hand and her daughter's hand on her shoulder, and the sky visible through the open roof above them. And she understood for the first time with her whole body, rather than just her thinking mind, what it meant to be the person who was given the thing everyone else had dismissed. Outside, 340 acres of Calloway estate stretched to the horizon in every direction, tended and managed and surveyed and accounted for to the last decimal point. And here, on a .8-acre parcel that her father's lawyer had described as unimproved agricultural land with a non-functional historic outbuilding, in the dark beneath a floor that no one had thought to lift in 136 years, something waited that had not been waiting for her brothers. It had been waiting for her. The flashlight beam reached the bottom of the shaft and did not disappear into soil or clay or any of the things that should have been 8 feet below the floor of a 19th century outbuilding. It landed on something that caught the light and held it, and threw it back upward in a way that soil does not and cannot. Nora held the light steady and looked down for a long time. What she could see in the narrow column of illumination was the curved surface of a metal container, a canister or a vessel of some kind, its exterior black with oxidation, but its shape still clean, still intentional. A lid fitted tight. Beside it, the edge of a second container, and beyond that, the suggestion of more, arranged in a pattern that the shaft's diameter would not let her fully see. McAllister was on his knees beside her, looking over her shoulder. "That's lid," he said, "of the canisters. Lid seal. You'd use lead if you wanted something to keep moisture out indefinitely." He was quiet for a moment. "Those have been down there a long time. How do we get them up?" He studied the shaft dimensions. "Someone has to go down. Or we rig a line." Lily was standing very still in the way she stood, when something had exceeded her capacity for ordinary reaction. Her voice, when it came, was smaller than usual. "Are we going to open them today?" Nora looked at the shaft, at the sealed darkness of it, at the 136 years of untouched, unbroken silence below the floor. She thought about what it meant to open something that had been sealed that long without knowing first what it contained, and what that meant, and what it would cost her to know. "No," she said. "Not today." Lily absorbed this without protest, which told Nora that her daughter understood the weight of the moment as clearly as she did. They covered the shaft with a piece of plywood from the debris pile and weighted it with stones, and drove back to Staunton in the late afternoon dark, with the heat blowing full, and neither of them saying much, both of them carrying the same particular silence that settles over people who have put their hands against something enormous and cannot yet say what shape it is. That night, after Lily was in bed, Nora sat at the kitchen table and did what she did with every problem she did not know how to solve, which was to break it into the parts she could name. She wrote on a legal pad in her careful, practical handwriting. The handwriting of someone who had learned that clarity on paper was a form of control over the things that felt uncontrollable. What is it? How much? What are my rights? Who else knows? What happens next? She started with what she knew. The shaft was on her property, inside the walls of the Dovecote, which the deed conveyed to her in full. Whatever was in the shaft was legally hers, unless it could be demonstrated otherwise. And the standard for demonstrating otherwise in Virginia property law was, she suspected, higher than her brother's indignation. She was not a lawyer. She needed to find one. Not Warren Aldous, who was the estate's attorney and therefore structurally compromised. Someone else. Someone who did not owe her brothers anything. She wrote this down and underlined it. Then she wrote the number 8, which was the number of feet the shaft descended. And she wrote lead canisters, and she wrote multiple, and she wrote sealed, and she sat with these words for a while and thought about James Calloway in 1887, who had been a careful man, a very careful man, and who had gone to considerable trouble to build something that would hold weight and keep out moisture and remain undisturbed through the ordinary operations of a working farm for as long as a farm might operate. James had been 71 years old when he died in 1912. He had lived long enough to see the panic of 1893, the silver crisis, 2 major banking collapses, and the beginning of a new century, whose financial reliability he had presumably not taken on faith. He had had, by Helen Price's account, a particular relationship with the question of what kept its value. Gold kept its value. Gold was what careful men who had watched paper money burn chose when they wanted something that would outlast the decisions of governments and the failures of banks. Gold in lead canisters, sealed below flagstone, below a building, below a floor that no one had a reason to lift. Nora stared at what she had written and felt the number forming in the back of her mind, the way a shape forms in fog before you can name it. She did not write it down. It was too large to write down. Yet. She wrote instead, "Call an attorney," and went to bed. The attorney she found was a woman named Delia Vance, who practiced in Staunton, and whose professional focus was property law and estate disputes, and who had the additional quality of having grown up in Augusta County, and therefore knowing, without needing it explained, what it meant to be the Calloway daughter who had received the .8 acres. Nora drove to her office on the second Wednesday in December and sat across from a desk covered in organized stacks of paper and explained the situation in the careful, sequential way she had learned to explain things when she needed to be taken seriously. Delia Vance listened without interrupting. She was 47, with reading glasses she never actually put on her face, but held in one hand while she thought, and the quality of stillness that distinguishes people who have heard many things that surprised them and learned not to let surprise show. When Nora finished, Delia put her glasses down on the desk. "The property is yours," she said, Clean deed. Full conveyance. Whatever is within the boundary of the Eastfield parcel, including any subterranean features, is yours under Virginia property law. That part is simple. What's the complicated part? Delia folded her hands. Your brothers are going to claim the discovery belongs to the estate. They'll argue that the shaft and whatever is in it predates the partition of the estate, and should therefore be treated as estate property subject to equal division. Can they win that argument? Not easily. But they can make it expensive and slow. She paused. Has either of your brothers mentioned the fire lane? Why? Delia opened a folder she had pulled before Nora arrived, which meant she had done some research in the days since Nora had called to make the appointment. Because there is a question about the fire lane's legal status. Your deed grants you access by the existing fire lane along the eastern fence line. But the fire lane itself is not a deeded easement. It was maintained by your father as a practical matter. Your brothers, as the new owners of the estate, could argue they have the right to close it, which would leave her landlocked, which would make it very difficult to access your property with any equipment necessary for, say, excavating a shaft. Nora looked at her. You already know something. I know that Philip Calloway filed a survey request for the eastern boundary of the estate 2 weeks ago, Delia said. The timing is notable. Nora thought about the conversation she had had with Gareth after the will reading, the neutrality she had maintained, the question she had asked about existing surveys. She had thought she was being careful. She had not been careful enough. What do I do? You move faster than they do. Aunt Delia set down her glasses. We file for a formal easement by necessity. You are landlocked without the fire lane. Virginia courts have consistently held that an owner of landlocked property is entitled to an easement across adjacent land for access. It is not guaranteed, but it is well established. We file Monday. We get on the court calendar before their survey becomes a legal instrument. And in the meantime, you do not tell anyone what you found under that floor. Not your brothers. Not anyone except people whose professional help you need. If this is what I think it might be, the moment it becomes public knowledge, your situation becomes considerably more complicated. What do you think it might be? Delia was quiet for a moment. I think James Calloway was a man who converted a very large amount of wealth into a form that would survive indefinitely. And I think he did it in a location that he then transferred, whether deliberately or by some structural understanding of what he was doing, through the generations of his estate, until it arrived at the one person in his family line who was given the smallest parcel, and therefore the most complete ownership of the thing that mattered. Whether he intended that, Nora said slowly, or whether it was accident. Does it matter? Nora thought about her father sitting at the desk in the estate house, organizing his final act with the precision he brought to everything. She thought about the will and the specific language of the bequest, the parcel of land surrounding and including the stone dovecote structure, not the estate, not the house, not the orchards or the equipment or the timber rights, the parcel surrounding and including the stone dovecote. Including, she said. Delia nodded. He knew, Nora said. Not everything. Maybe not the specifics. But he knew there was something there. He put it in the will language deliberately. We cannot prove that. No. But it's true. Delia picked up her glasses again. Sometimes the truth is the thing you know and cannot prove. Our job is to make sure the law protects what the truth already established. The easement filing happened the following Monday, as promised. Nora did not tell her brothers it was coming. She learned about their reaction from Helen Price, who called on a Thursday evening 2 weeks later. Your brother Gareth was out here today, Helen said. in that big truck of his. He stopped at the end of my lane and sat there for a while, just looking across toward the Dovecote. Then he left. Did he come to the door? No, he just looked. Helen paused. He called me last week, actually. Before today. Asked if you had been out to visit me. I told him we had met and had coffee. He asked if I had told you anything about the history of the property. I said we'd talked about the Calloway family generally. He thanked me and hung up. What did his voice sound like when he thanked you? Helen considered this with the seriousness it deserved, like a man who already knows something and is trying to find out how much other people know. Nora stood at the apartment window, looking down at the street below, where a fine December rain was making the asphalt shine under the streetlights. She thought about Gareth in his truck at the end of Helen's lane, looking across the field at the Dovecote in the cold. He had walked past that structure his entire life. He had eaten at the estate table and managed the estate fields and inherited the estate house and never once thought to lift the floor. She almost felt something for him in that moment. Almost. The question of how to raise the canisters from the shaft without attracting attention was one that McAllister solved with the quiet practicality that she had come to understand was his fundamental mode of operating in the world. He arrived on a Saturday morning in mid-December with a hand winch, a length of braided steel cable, a nylon harness, to hand the information that he had been doing structural work and excavation in this county for 28 years, and that the one thing you learned in that time was how to do things without making a production of them. He went down the shaft himself, lowering himself on the cable with the deliberate competence of a man who had been in tighter spaces and smaller margins. Lily sat on the far side of the Dovecote, with her knees drawn up and her eyes fixed on the opening in the floor, watching with the same expression she brought to the last chapters of difficult books. The first canister came up on the cable 12 minutes after McAllister descended. It was heavier than its size suggested it should be, and the cable bowed with the weight of it, as Nora and Lily together pulled it hand over hand through the shaft opening and lowered it to the floor. It was roughly cylindrical, perhaps 14 inches in length and 8 in diameter, sealed at both ends, with lead caps that had been hammered over the canister's threaded ends, with the thoroughness of someone who intended the seal to last longer than he did. The exterior was black with oxidation, but structurally sound. No corrosion through the wall, no deformation. Whatever had been inside it had remained inside it. McAllister came up after it. "There are 11 down there," he said, "all the same size. And something else underneath them. Flat, wrapped in oilskin." Nora looked at the canister on the floor. She looked at Lily. She looked at McAllister. "All right," she said. She found a pry bar in McAllister's toolbox. She worked the flat edge of it under the lead cap at the nearer end of the canister and pressed down, and the cap gave with the long, grinding resistance of lead that has been compressed against threads for over a century, and then it came free with a sound like a seal breaking, which was exactly what it was. The interior of the canister was dry. The lead had done its work. She tilted the open end toward herself and looked in, and in the beam of the flashlight, she saw a column of discs stacked edge to edge the full length of the interior, each one perhaps an inch thick and an inch and a half in diameter, packed so closely they could not shift. She tipped the canister carefully and let the top disc slide out into her palm. It was heavier than she expected. Significantly heavier. The weight of it landed in her palm and stayed there with the authority of something that does not apologize for what it is. It was a coin. Old, worn at the edges, but the face of it still readable. She held the flashlight over it and looked. A Liberty head. The date below it read 1880. On the reverse, in the beam of the light, The denomination was clear: $20. She stood in the cold of the Dovecote with a $20 gold piece in her hand that had been sealed in a lead canister below a flagstone floor for 136 years, and felt the world shift under her feet with the slow, tectonic certainty of something that was not going to shift back. A $20 gold piece in 1880 contained roughly an ounce of gold. In the current market, an ounce of gold was valued at approximately $1,900. But these were not bullion coins. These were Liberty Head double eagles in a state of preservation that no coin produced in ordinary circulation had a right to achieve. Coins kept dry and sealed and undisturbed for 136 years, never touched, never spent, never handled by anyone who might have introduced the oils of their skin to the surface. She knew enough to know that the numismatic value, the collector's value, the value that arose not just from gold content, but from age and rarity and condition, would be multiples of the bullion price, possibly many multiples. She counted the column from the open end of the canister: 50 coins. Then she looked at the 10 sealed canisters still on the floor. McAllister, who had been watching all of this with the expression of a man whose professional assessment of the situation was running considerably ahead of his willingness to speak about it, said quietly, "The thing wrapped in oilskin at the bottom. It wasn't a canister. What was it?" He looked at her steadily. It was a ledger. Old leather, tied with cord. "A record," she said. "That would be my guess." The decision to bring up the remaining canisters took most of the afternoon. McAllister went down twice more, sending the canisters up on the cable in pairs, while Nora and Lily received them. The oilskin-wrapped ledger came up last, carefully, McAllister holding it against his chest on the final ascent, rather than risk the cable's pressure on something that old. 11 canisters, 50 coins apiece. 550 coins in total. So every one of them a Liberty Head double eagle in sealed, preservation-grade condition. There was also, beneath the coins in 4 of the canisters, a layer of something that caught the flashlight differently from metal. Smaller, irregular. Nora worked one of these out with her fingernail and held it in the light. A stone. Deep blue, faceted, the size of a small marble. She was not a gemologist. She did not know sapphires from topaz from aquamarine, except by a general impression of color and quality. But she knew that the stone in her hand was not glass, and she knew that the clarity of it, the depth, the way the light moved through it rather than stopping at the surface, was not a quality that came cheap. There were, she counted carefully, 47 such stones distributed across the 4 canisters. Some blue, some a clear pale yellow, and some a deep red that pulsed at its center in a way that she did not have words for. She set them in a row on the cleanest section of flagstone and looked at them in the December light that came down through the open roof. McAllister crouched beside her. "James Calloway," he said, "was a very careful man." "Yes," Nora said. "He was." The ledger was in better condition than it had any right to be. The oilskin had done its job. The leather beneath it had survived. And when Nora untied the cord with hands that were no longer entirely steady, the pages opened to a handwriting she recognized from Helen Price's description as deliberate and precise, the handwriting of a man who wrote the way he built things, with an attention to permanence. The first page was dated August of 1887. Below the date, in James Calloway's hand, a single line, a record of what is kept here, and why. She read the ledger at the kitchen table that night after Lily was asleep, working through the faded ink with a magnifying glass she had bought at the pharmacy on the way home. The ledger was 42 pages, and it contained the complete accounting of James Calloway's decision, made in the summer of 1887, to transfer a significant portion of his accumulated wealth out of banknotes, bonds, and institutional instruments, and into a form he considered proof against the failures he had already witnessed once and expected to witness again. He had been 52 years old. He had spent the previous 15 years building a commercial enterprise in Staunton that dealt primarily in finished goods and raw materials, and in the course of that enterprise, he had dealt extensively with suppliers and buyers across several states, and had conducted a portion of his business in commodities that included, for a period in the early 1870s, a trading arrangement with a dealer in Baltimore who handled imported stones and precious metals for the luxury goods market. He had, over a period of roughly 12 years, converted his surplus earnings into gold coin at a rate that corresponded with his distrust of any given year's financial stability, which was to say, steadily and without interruption. He had also, at the recommendation of the Baltimore dealer, purchased a quantity of gemstones that the dealer had acquired through an estate liquidation in Europe, and that he considered to be of investment quality, meaning that their value was sufficiently established and their authenticity sufficiently documented to serve as a reliable store of wealth independent of any currency market. The ledger recorded all of this in James Calloway's accountant's hand. The coins, 490 double eagles purchased between 1872 and 1886, plus 60 additional pieces received in trade for goods and services, all of Liberty Head design, and all in uncirculated or near uncirculated condition at the time of sealing. The stones, 47 pieces total, consisting of 19 sapphires, 14 yellow diamonds, and 14 rubies, all acquired from the Baltimore dealer in 3 separate transactions between 1877 and 1884, while all accompanied at the time of purchase by written assessments from the dealer that James had included in the ledger as folded inserts behind the relevant entries. The assessments described the stones in the language of the period, which was more poetic and less standardized than modern gemological terminology. But the qualities described, clarity, color depth, weight, origin, were clear enough. The largest of the sapphires was described as being of Burma origin, of exceptional depth of color, weighing approximately 22 carats. The largest ruby was similarly described, of Mogok origin, 14 carats, of a purity that the dealer had characterized as rarely encountered in stones of this size available to the private market. Nora sat at the kitchen table and read these descriptions and thought about James Calloway lowering 11 lead canisters down a shaft in the floor of a stone dovecote in August of 1887, and sealing the shaft with a flagstone and building a bird loft on top of it, and farming his land for the remaining 25 years of his life. She thought about his son inheriting the estate, and his son's son, and Edgar Calloway managing 340 acres, and 3 children, and 1 working farm, and the practical daily demands of all of that, and never once having a reason to lift the floor of a crumbling outbuilding at the far end of the eastern field. She thought about Gareth and Phillip in their expensive shirts, sitting across the mahogany table, while Warren Aldous read out the word, Dovecote. And she thought about $11 an hour, and the bathroom faucet, and the eviction notice she had received 6 weeks before her father died, which she had paid down to manageable with the last of the money in her savings account, which had left her with $412 in the bank, which was the entire liquid sum of her net worth on the day she had sat in the parking garage and felt the weight of her father's careful accounting press down on her. She closed the ledger carefully and put it in the waterproof bag she had brought home for the purpose, and sealed it and put it in the back of the closet behind her winter coats. Then she sat in the kitchen for a long time and listened to the faucet drip and thought about what came next. What came next was the gemologist. His name was Arthur Fenwick, and he operated out of an office in Richmond that had the appearance of a place that had been doing one specific thing very well for a very long time, which was accurate. He was 64 and had spent 31 of those years assessing stones for estate sales, insurance purposes, and private collections. And he had the quality that Nora had begun to notice in people who were genuinely expert in something, which was that they didn't need to perform their expertise because it was simply present in everything they did. Delia had found him. Delia had also, in the 2 weeks since their first meeting, filed the easement motion, done preliminary research into Virginia's treasure trove statutes, and had a preliminary conversation with a numismatist colleague in Washington who handled historical coin collections. She had done all of this with the same organized efficiency that Nora was coming to rely on, and she had done it without once suggesting that the scale of the situation was unusual, which was either professional composure or the recognition that unusual situations were, in fact, her ordinary professional environment. Fenwick examined the stones in his office on a Wednesday morning while Lily was in school, and Nora sat across from him and watched his face. His face said very little. That was, she had come to understand, the face of a man who had learned not to let his reactions become part of the transaction. He worked for an hour and 40 minutes with a loop and a spectrometer and a scale and a set of reference materials that filled a rolling cart beside his desk. When he was done, he set down his loop and folded his hands and looked at her. Where did these come from? A family estate? My family. Can you tell me what you're looking at? He considered the question in the way he had considered all her questions, as though it deserved to be properly answered, rather than quickly answered. The sapphires, he said, are of Burmese origin. The color in Burmese sapphires has a particular quality that is distinguishable spectrographically from stones produced in other locations. The market for unheated natural Burmese sapphires of this size and quality is presently very active. He paused. The largest stone is 21.5 carats. It is internally flawless at the 10 times magnification level I have available here. A proper grading laboratory will want to examine it under higher magnification, but based on what I can see, this stone is exceptional. There is no other word that is accurate. What does exceptional mean in dollar terms? For a stone of this quality and size, natural, unheated, with confirmed Burmese origin, which the spectrographic data supports clearly, you are looking at a per-carat value in the range of $30,000 to $45,000 at the high end of the current market. For a 21-carat stone of this color and clarity, the total value is not simply a multiplication. Large stones at this quality level command a significant premium. He was quiet for a moment. My initial estimate for this stone alone would be in the range of $8 to $12 million. A major auction house might exceed that, depending on the appetite of the buyers in the room on a given day. Nora looked at the sapphire sitting in its small tray on Fenwick's desk. It was the color of deep water in full sunlight, a blue that seemed to come from inside the stone rather than from light reflecting off its surface. And the rubies? The rubies are Mogok Valley Burmese origin. The finest rubies in the world come from the Mogok Valley. The largest of yours is 14 carats, and the color is what the trade calls pigeon's blood, which is a specific chromium-saturated red that is extremely rare at this size. The ruby market is currently stronger than it has been in a decade. He picked up the largest ruby and held it under his desk lamp. This stone, if authenticated and offered at a major house, could bring $12 to $18 million. Possibly more. The market for exceptional rubies at this moment is not entirely predictable on the upside. Nora sat very still. And the diamonds? Yellow diamonds of this saturation are called fancy vivid in the trade classification system. The vivid designation applies only to stones, whose color saturation meets a specific threshold. 2 of your stones appear, under my examination, to be in the vivid category. The remaining 12 are intense, which is the next classification below vivid. The per-carat values for fancy, vivid yellow diamonds currently range from $20,000 to $30,000 per carat, with premiums for size. Your 2 vivid stones are 11 and 9 carats respectively. Fenwick set down the diamond he had been holding and looked at her directly. Miss Calloway-Marsh, the 47 stones in front of me represent, at my preliminary assessment, and excluding the price premiums that size and quality typically add at public auction, a value in the range of $90 to $110 million. I want to be clear that this is a gemologist's field assessment, not a formal appraisal, and that a proper auction house valuation could be higher. But I would not tell you a number I was not prepared to stand behind. Nora looked at the 47 stones in their small trays on Fenwick's desk. She thought about the 11 lead canisters and the 550 gold coins that the numismatist Delia had contacted was currently researching in Washington. She thought about James Calloway in 1887, writing his ledger in the candlelight of the Dovecote chamber before he sealed the shaft and went home for dinner. She thought about the number forming in the back of her mind that she had not been ready to write down. It was ready now. The news from the numismatist came 4 days later. His name was Gerald Park, and he spoke in the measured, slightly reverent tone of a man who had spent his professional life with objects that connected the present to the past. He had examined detailed photographs of the coins that Nora had sent under Delia's guidance, and had assessed them using the standard grading criteria of the professional coin grading service. Liberty Head double eagles in uncirculated condition from the 1870s and 1880s, he explained, are not common. They were produced in quantity, but quantity meant nothing if the coins were subsequently spent, worn, cleaned, or damaged. Coins that had been sealed at or near the time of minting in conditions that preserved their original surfaces were, in the numismatic world, significant finds. The collector market for high-grade 19th-century American gold coinage was deep and consistent, driven by a combination of metal value, rarity, and historical significance. He estimated the 550 coins, based on the photographic evidence and the stated storage conditions, at an average grade of MS-63 to MS-65 on the Sheldon scale, with some specimens potentially grading higher pending physical examination. At those grades, he said, individual double eagles from the key dates in the collection trade in the range of $3,000 to $15,000 per coin, with the most desirable dates and mint marks commanding premiums at the higher end or above. For a group of 550 coins of this quality and variety, representing continuous production across a 14-year period, the collection value as a unified lot, which tends to command a premium over individual coin values due to the historical completeness of the grouping, would be, in his estimate, somewhere between $180 and $220 million. He was also interested, he said, in whether she had considered whether the coins might be placed with a major auction house rather than sold privately, as the competitive dynamics of a properly marketed auction tended to drive realized prices above pre-sale estimates for collections of this significance, and this was a collection of considerable significance. Nora thanked him and ended the call and sat in the parking lot of the shopping center, where she had pulled over to take the call, and looked at the number that was now fully formed in her mind. Stones. 90 to 110 million. Preliminary, probably higher at auction. Coins. 180 to 220 million. Preliminary, probably higher at auction. Total, somewhere in the range of $270 to $330 million, hidden in a lead-sealed shaft under a flagstone floor in a .8-acre parcel that her brothers had laughed at. The midpoint of that range was $300 million. James Calloway had been a very, very careful man. She called Delia. "We have a number," she said. "What number?" "Around 300 million, give or take. Maybe more." The silence on Delia's end lasted long enough to be meaningful. Then Delia said, "All right. We need to move to the next phase. The easement hearing is in 3 weeks. Before that hearing, we need to have the collection formally cataloged and appraised, the contents of the shaft documented by a qualified third party, and the discovery properly registered under Virginia property law. Once the discovery is on the legal record, your brother's ability to challenge the ownership of the contents becomes significantly more complicated. When does this become public?" Delia thought about this. "Not until we choose to make it public. And when we do, we want to control how it happens. Is there a risk they find out before the hearing?" "There is always a risk. People talk. McAllister knows. Fenwick knows. Park knows. Each of those is a potential disclosure. All 3 of them signed confidentiality agreements." "Good. Then we move as fast as we can, and we keep the circle small." Nora drove home through the December afternoon and picked Lily up from school and made dinner in the small apartment kitchen and watched her daughter do homework at the kitchen table, the same table where Nora had sat 2 months ago, counting the weeks between paychecks. She thought about what $300 million meant and what it didn't mean, and which of those things mattered more. It meant Lily's education. It meant the apartment lease released, the faucet fixed by someone other than herself. It meant the dry cleaner and alterations shop on Market Street becoming, in her life, a thing that had happened and then ended. It meant, in the most immediate and practical terms she could apply to it, that the particular texture of daily scarcity that had defined her life for the past several years was going to change so completely and so suddenly that she did not have adequate emotional vocabulary for what came after it. It did not mean that her brothers were going to accept what had happened with Grace. That understanding arrived the following Thursday in the form of a letter delivered by certified mail to the apartment on Decatur Street. The letter was from Aldous and Crane, attorneys at law. It was addressed to Nora Patricia Calloway-Marsh, and it was written in the careful, dense language of legal correspondence, and it made 4 specific claims. First, that the fire lane accessing the Eastfield parcel had been maintained as a matter of courtesy by the Calloway estate, and that its continued use was not guaranteed under the terms of any recorded easement, and that the estate's new owners, Gareth and Phillip Calloway, intended to evaluate the lane's status pending survey. Second, that the Eastfield parcel, as conveyed in the will of Edgar Calloway, constituted a landlocked parcel whose only viable access had historically depended on the goodwill of the adjacent estate owners, and that this situation had implications for the parcel's marketability and structural independence. Third, that the estate's accounting review had identified that James Calloway, in his 1887 estate planning, had recorded certain asset transfers that were not reflected in subsequent estate inventories, and that these discrepancies raised questions about whether certain assets had been properly transmitted through the estate's succession, potentially creating a claim by the current estate beneficiaries to any assets discovered to have been improperly excluded from prior estate transmissions. Fourth, and finally, that it was the hope of the estate's current administrators that these matters could be resolved cooperatively and without resort to litigation, and that Gareth and Phillip Calloway remained open to purchasing the Eastfield parcel at a fair market value to be determined by independent appraisal. Nora read the letter 3 times. She read the third point a 4th time, slowly, parsing the language of it. They knew, or they suspected. Not the specifics, not the numbers. But they had gone back into the estate's old records, which was what the accounting review meant, and they had found something. James Calloway's ledger, or a reference to it, or some other indication that there were assets in 1887 that did not appear in the 1912 estate inventory when James died. Which meant that James Calloway had not left any record of the Dovecote cash in the estate's files. He had sealed it and kept it separate from the formal estate documentation, and in the 25 years between the sealing and his death, he had not disclosed it to his heirs. Why? She sat with that question for the rest of the evening. James Calloway had been a careful man. He had kept his ledger. He had recorded everything in careful detail. But he had not told his son. Maybe he had meant to. Maybe he had planned to tell him when the time was right, and the time had never come. Maybe the 1912 estate had been settled so quickly after his death that no one had thought to ask. Or maybe James Calloway had known exactly what he was doing. Maybe a man who had watched banks fail and money burn had understood that the most reliable protection for something valuable was not a vault or a safe or a legal instrument, but the fact that no one else knew it existed. Maybe he had trusted, with the particular faith of a careful man who thought in generations, that the right person would eventually come looking. She called Delia and read her the letter. Delia said, "This is what I expected. The third point is the one that matters. They're trying to establish a prior claim to anything found on the parcel by arguing that it was estate property that was never properly inventoried. Can they succeed with that argument? In Virginia, personal property concealed on real estate at the time of a property transfer conveys with the real estate, unless there is a specific reservation in the deed. There is no such reservation in your deed. Your father's will transferred the parcel and everything it contained, including anything beneath the floor, to you in full. Their argument has a surface plausibility and no legal foundation. But it will cost me money to defeat it. It will cost you money to defeat it," Delia agreed, "which is partly their purpose. They are hoping the cost discourages you from proceeding." She thought about $412 in the bank and the dry cleaner on Market Street, and the 11 months remaining on the apartment lease. She thought about the coins in their lead canisters and the sapphires in their rows on Fenwick's desk. "Let them hope," she said. 2 days later, Nora drove out to the Dovecote alone, in the early morning before the sky had finished deciding what color it intended to be. The field was frozen, the grass brittle under her boots, the air sharp with the particular dry cold of a Virginia December in the valley. She walked across the field as she always did, watching the Dovecote grow larger as she approached, and she stood in front of it with her hands in her coat pockets and looked at it for a long time. The stone was the same stone it had always been. The lichen was the same silver green. The arched door still stood at its diagonal on its remaining hinge. The open sky was still visible through the roof where the timber loft had been. From the estate house, perhaps half a mile across the fields, she could see a light in an upstairs window. Someone awake early, or Gareth or Phillip, or one of their families, moving through the rooms of the house that had been their father's and was now theirs, through the space that had been designed for them in a way that the .8 acres at the eastern boundary had not. She thought about her father sitting at his desk. She thought about the will language, the parcel surrounding and including. She thought about Edgar Calloway, who had been a precise man, who had loved the land in a mathematical way, who had looked at 3 children and distributed a 340-acre estate, with careful equity to 2 of them, and given the third a crumbling outbuilding, and a fire lane, and a deed that said including. She did not know whether he had known. She might never know. But she knew that the word including was in the document, and that it was not a careless word from a man who did not use careless words. She put her hand on the stone of the Dovecote, the cold limestone under her palm, and she thought about James Calloway lowering his ledger and his canisters into the dark and sealing the shaft and climbing back up into the light and walking home across this same field in the summer of 1887. She thought about what it meant to keep something safe for a very long time. She thought about Gareth's laugh in the mahogany room and Philip's expression of practiced concern, and Warren Aldis's certified letter and the survey request for the eastern boundary, and all the mechanisms currently in motion to diminish and complicate and ultimately reclaim what a man in 1887 had sealed away, and a dead woman in her 40s had pressed into an ironing board and tried to survive, and a 10-year-old girl had looked at and said, "That's where it's hidden." She looked at the Dovecote for a long time. Then she went inside and sat on the flagstone floor beside the covered shaft and waited for the light to improve. And while she waited, she pulled out her phone and called Lily's school and asked whether it would be possible for Lily to have a half day on Friday, because there was something her daughter needed to see. She called McAllister next and asked him to be there Friday morning with the winch and the cable and whatever else he thought he needed. And then she sat in the cold of the Dovecote and listened to the sound of the field outside, the wind in the dead grass, the creak of the timber door on its remaining hinge, the particular quiet of a place that has been keeping something for a very long time and has not yet been asked to give it up. The hearing was in 3 weeks. The appraisers were coming Monday. The certified letter was sitting on the kitchen table at the apartment on Decatur Street, and Warren Aldis was waiting for her response, and her brothers were in the house across the field with their survey request and their accounting review and their lawyer and their certainty that the woman with the .8 acres would eventually understand the reasonableness of selling. They did not know yet what they were asking her to sell. They did not know about the ledger or the coins or Fenwick's careful measurements or the per-carat values of 21-carat Burmese sapphires in the current market. They did not know that Delia had already been in contact with a senior specialist at Christie's, New York, or that the numismatist in Washington was preparing a formal catalog of 550 Liberty Head double eagles, or that the stonework at the base of the Dovecote had been photographed by an architectural historian from the University of Virginia, who had driven down on a Saturday and stood in the field in the cold and said, quietly and with complete professional conviction, that what he was looking at in the base courses of the structure predated every known European settlement in the valley, and possibly predated every known settlement of any kind, which had implications not only for the historical significance of the site, but for its potential protected status under state and federal cultural heritage law. That they did not know any of that. They knew only what they had always known, which was that the Dovecote was a crumbling outbuilding at the edge of an otherwise productive estate, and that their sister had accepted it from their father's will with the quiet, unreadable expression she brought to everything, and had then begun going out to it on weekends with her daughter and a stonemason, and had filed an easement motion that was, in their assessment, an attempt to extract some marginal value from a situation that had never offered much. They were wrong about all of it. But they were not wrong about Nora going out to it on weekends. She was doing exactly that, and she intended to keep doing it, because the thing in the shaft was hers, and the stone around it was hers, and the history beneath it was hers, and the field around it on .8 acres was hers, and the word including in her father's will was hers in the most complete and legally defensible sense that a word could belong to a person. She sat on the flagstone floor of the Dovecote and felt the cold stone under her and the frozen field around her and the gray December sky above and the weight of $300 million below. And she thought about what came next. What came next was everything. But first, it was Friday, and Lily was going to see it. Friday arrived the way significant days sometimes do, quietly, without announcing itself as anything other than an ordinary morning. The sky was pale and still over the valley, the kind of winter sky that holds its light close to the ground rather than releasing it upward, and the grass in the eastern field crunched under their boots as Nora and Lily walked toward the Dovecote in the cold. Lily had not asked questions on the drive out. She had sat in the passenger seat with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the road ahead, in the particular stillness of a child who understands that she is being brought to something and that the right response to being brought to something is patience. McAllister's truck was already at the fire lane when they arrived. He was standing outside the Dovecote door with coffee in a thermos and the winch set up and ready. And when Lily came across the field, he nodded at her with the respect he gave to people who had earned it, which Lily had, by showing up and working and not making anything harder than it needed to be. Inside the Dovecote, Nora moved the plywood cover from the shaft. She handed Lily the flashlight. "Look down," she said. Lily crouched at the edge of the shaft and put the light into it and looked. The shaft was empty now, the canisters having been removed to the secure storage unit in Staunton that Delia had arranged. But the shaft itself was still there, its dark stone walls descending 8 feet into the earth, and at the bottom, the faint marks in the soil where the canisters had rested for 136 years, and the impression left by the oilskin-wrapped ledger, and the general quality of a space that had held something important for a very long time, and was still vibrating quietly with that history. Lily looked for a long time. Then she looked up at her mother. "He put everything in there," she said. "Everything he had saved." Yes, and nobody knew. Nobody knew. Lily stood up slowly. Her face held the expression that Nora had come to recognize as the one her daughter produced when the size of something exceeded what she had expected, which was not overwhelm, but a kind of settling, a recalibration of what she understood the world to be capable of. "How much?" Lily asked. Nora told her the numbers, not as abstractions, but as specifically as she could. She described the coins, the stones, the ledger, the gemologist's careful measurements, the numismatist's catalog, the estimates from people who did this work for a living, and whose estimates were not guesses, but assessments. She told her daughter the number in the middle of the range, the number that was probably the floor rather than the ceiling, given what the auction specialists had said. $319 million, she said. That is what the collection has been formally appraised at by Christie's New York, pending final authentication on 3 of the stones and 6 of the key date coins, which will happen next month. Lily was quiet. "Is that ours?" "It is ours." Another silence. Outside, the frozen field lay still under the pale sky. Uncle Gareth laughed. Lily said, "At the will reading. You told me he laughed." "He did." Lily looked at the shaft one more time. Then she looked at her mother, with the dark eyes that were Nora's eyes in a 10-year-old's face. "He laughed at the wrong thing," she said. "Yes, baby. He laughed at exactly the wrong thing." The easement hearing was held on a Monday in the Augusta County Circuit Court, in a room that smelled like old wood, and the specific institutional calm of spaces where decisions got made that people then had to live with. The judge was a woman in her 60s named Harriet Blount, who had the bearing of someone who had been listening to property disputes for long enough to recognize when a dispute was about property, and when it was about something else entirely. Delia had prepared thoroughly. She presented the survey documentation establishing that the Eastfield parcel was landlocked, that the fire lane had served as the parcel's sole access for the full duration of Nora's ownership, and for decades prior under Edgar Calloway's management, that Virginia case law on easements by necessity was clear and consistent, and that the closing of the lane would constitute a material deprivation of the parcel's utility that no reasonable reading of property law could support. Warren Aldous presented the estate's counter-argument, which was that the lane's historical use had been permissive and informal, that no recorded easement existed, and that the estate's new owners had a right to control their own land. Judge Blount heard both sides without visible impatience. She asked Aldous 2 questions. He answered them. Then she asked Delia 1 question, which was whether the landlocked parcel had any alternative means of access. Delia said it did not. Judge Blount said she had heard enough. She granted the easement. The lane was Nora's by legal right, to be recorded in the county deed records within 30 days, a permanent and irrevocable for so long as the Eastfield parcel remained a separate parcel under separate ownership. Aldous gathered his papers with the efficiency of a man accustomed to unfavorable rulings. He did not look at Nora as he left the room. Delia touched Nora's arm. "That's one," she said quietly. Outside the courthouse, in the parking lot where the December wind moved between the cars with a low persistence, Nora called Helen Price. Not because Helen needed to know the legal outcome, but because Helen was the person who had sat across a kitchen table and told her about James Calloway and the word secure. And she was the person who had looked at Lily with that unclassifiable expression when Lily said, "That's where it's hidden," Helen answered on the second ring. "We won the easement," Nora said. A silence. Then, "Good." Helen. "Yes." He put it under the floor. "Like you said, like your grandmother said, he put everything down there." A longer silence. "I know," Helen said. "Or I thought I might know. I didn't say it outright because knowing and saying it are different things, and it wasn't mine to say." "Why did you tell me about him at all then? About the word secure and the panic and what keeps its value?" "Because it was yours to find out," Helen said. "Not mine to hand you. There's a difference between leaving a door open and pushing someone through it." She paused. "Your father knew too, I think." "Not precisely. But he knew the parcel was the right thing to give you. He just couldn't say it directly." "Why couldn't he say it?" "Because Edgar Calloway was his father's son, and his father's son before that, all the way back to James. They were all men who showed what they meant rather than saying it." She was quiet for a moment. "You are not like them in that way. That is why it worked." Nora stood in the parking lot with the phone to her ear and the cold wind moving around her, and thought about a line of men who showed rather than said. And the one person in the line who had been given the smallest piece because she was the one who knew how to look. "Thank you," she said. "For the coffee, for the kitchen, for the door." "Come visit when this is over," Helen said. "I'll make pie." The Christie's specialist who came to Staunton in January was a woman named Dr. Petra Halverson, who ran the jewelry and gemstone department at Christie's New York, and who had been, by her own account, unable to think about much else in the 3 weeks since Gerald Park had forwarded the preliminary documentation on the collection. She was 41, and spoke with the precision of someone for whom precision was a form of respect for the things she studied, and she brought with her a portable spectrographic analyzer, a senior gemologist from Christie's London office, and the kind of concentrated professional attention that expensive objects receive from people who have devoted their lives to understanding them. She examined the stones for 2 days in the secure room Delia had arranged in a bank facility in Staunton. She examined the coins for a 3rd day with Gerald Park present, the two of them working in the careful, slightly reverent silence of professionals handling things that deserved careful handling. On the 4th day, she sat across from Nora in Delia's office and gave her the formal assessment. "The collection," she said, "is extraordinary in a way that is not a figure of speech. The gemstones are among the finest privately held specimens I have encountered in 20 years of this work. The Burmese sapphires are exceptional as a group, and the largest stone is individually significant enough that I expect it to generate serious international interest. The rubies include 2 that I would place among the finest natural rubies currently available on the private market. The yellow diamonds, once formally graded, will include at least 3 specimens in the fancy vivid category." She set a folder on the desk. The formal pre-sale estimate for the gemstone portion of the collection, accounting for the current market and the anticipated buyer interest in pieces of this rarity and provenance, is $140 to $180 million. That range is conservative. I would not be surprised by a higher result. She set a second folder beside the first. The coin collection, in consultation with Mr. Park's catalog and our own numismatic specialists, carries a pre-sale estimate of $135 to $155 million as a unified lot. The historical completeness of the grouping, spanning 14 years of Liberty Head production with multiple mint marks represented at very high grades, is a significant factor. There are collectors who have spent decades assembling collections less complete than this one. She folded her hands. The total pre-sale estimate for the collection as a whole is $275 to $335 million. Given the quality of the material and the appetite, we are already observing from international clients who have been made aware in general terms that a significant collection is coming to market. I believe the realized total will be at the higher end of that range or above it. The midpoint, Delia said, for formal purposes. $305 million, Halverson said. Though I would not hold you to the middle. Nora looked at the 2 folders on the desk and thought about the lead canisters going into the shaft in 1887 and coming out of it in December, and the number that had formed in the back of her mind in the parking lot of the shopping center and was now sitting in a Christie's pre-sale estimate on a mahogany desk in an attorney's office in Staunton, Virginia. $319 million, she said. That is the number I have been using. Halverson looked at her. Why that number specifically? Because that was what the preliminary estimates added up to, and I wanted to use a number I believed rather than a number I hoped for. Halverson nodded slowly. That is a reasonable position. What happens when this becomes public? Halverson looked at Delia. That is your counsel's question more than mine. But I will tell you that the art and collectibles world is not a small place, and news of a discovery of this magnitude will not remain contained indefinitely. My recommendation would be to announce on your timeline, in your terms, before someone else announces it in theirs. Delia had already drafted the press release. She had been working on it for 2 weeks, in the same organized way she had worked on everything, and when she showed it to Nora that evening, it was clear and factual and gave nothing away that Nora had not authorized. It described the discovery in the terms that were accurate. A collection of 19th century American gold coins and gemstones, concealed beneath the floor of a historic stone dovecote on a rural Virginia property, discovered by the property's owner following her inheritance of the parcel. The collection, assembled by a member of the Calloway family of Augusta County in the 1870s and 1880s and sealed in 1887, had remained undiscovered for 136 years. Christie's New York had been retained to handle the collection sale, with a pre-sale estimate of $275 to $335 million. It did not mention Gareth. It did not mention Phillip. It did not mention the mahogany room, or the word Dovecote, or the sound of laughter in a space designed for the reading of final things. It did not need to. The story told itself. Gareth called the morning after the press release went out, which was the morning after Christie's posted the announcement on their website, and 3 major newspapers ran it in their arts and culture sections, and a photograph of the Dovecote, font taken by the Christie's photographer who had come to document the shaft and the site, appeared on the front page of the Staunton News Leader under a headline about the Shenandoah Valley and hidden gold and a family legacy that no one had known was there. Gareth's number appeared on her phone, and she looked at it for a long moment and then answered. His voice was different from any version of it she had previously heard. Not the formal information delivery voice of the death notification. Not the measured reasonableness of the will reading. Not the concerned practicality of his offers to buy her out at $15,000 and then $22,000, and then something mutually agreeable. This voice was quieter, stripped of its professional overlay. He said her name. She said his. A long silence. "I didn't know," he said finally. "I know you didn't." "Dad, do you think he knew?" She thought about the will language, and the word including, and the precision of a man who had loved the land, the way some people love mathematics. "I think he had a sense of it. I don't think he knew exactly. But I think he knew the parcel was the right thing to give me." Another silence. Outside her apartment window, Staunton was going about its morning in the ordinary way, indifferent to what was happening in the space between a brother and a sister on a phone call that had been a long time coming. "I laughed," Gareth said. "I know. In the lawyer's office, when Aldous read it. I laughed at you." Yes. She did not say that it was all right, because it was not all right, and they both knew it, and there was no point in performing forgiveness before forgiveness had actually arrived. But she did not say anything unkind either, because the man on the phone was her brother, and he was speaking in a voice she had not heard from him since they were children, and their mother was alive, and nothing had hardened yet into the shapes it would harden into. "Come see it," she said instead, "before the auction. Come out and look at the site. Bring Phillip if he wants to come. Walk across the field and stand in the Dovecote and put your hand in the shaft and understand what was there." He was quiet for a moment. "Why would you want that?" "Because it is a Calloway who put it there. It belongs to the family history, even if it belongs to me by law. And because," she said, "I want you to see it. I want you to know what was in the thing you laughed at." They came on a Saturday 2 weeks before the Christie's auction, Gareth and Phillip together, in Gareth's truck, which they parked at the fire lane access, and walked across the field in the kind of quiet that had not previously characterized either of their interactions with Nora in the last 2 months. McAllister was not there. It was just the 3 of them in the Dovecote, and the shaft with its plywood cover removed, and the 400 nesting alcoves rising in their rows above, and the sky through the open roof. Gareth crouched at the edge of the shaft and looked down. He was there for a long time. Phillip crouched beside him, and then stood and walked the perimeter of the space, running his hand along the base courses, the older stone, the dry-laid container that was older than the English settlements in the valley. When Gareth stood up, his face held an expression that Nora recognized because she had felt it herself. The recalibration, the settling, the adjustment to a world larger than the one you had assumed. He had walked past this place his entire life. He had grown up on the estate, and managed its fields, and negotiated its timber rights, and calculated its acreage, and understood it, he had thought, completely. He had stood in a lawyer's office and laughed at a word, and the word had been the word that mattered, and the parcel it described had contained the thing that changed everything. He looked at his sister. He said, "I am sorry, Nora." She let it land. She did not deflect it or diminish it, or say anything that would allow either of them to pretend it was smaller than it was. "I know," she said. Philip was looking at the flagstones, at the center stone replaced in its position, at the joints around it. He said, without turning, "I sent a structural engineer out here, John, before Christmas. I asked him to assess whether the building was a safety hazard. I know." He turned. He looked at her. He did not ask how she knew. He said, "I was going to use it to get the parcel demolished and returned to the estate." Yes. Philip was not a man given to visible discomfort, but he was uncomfortable now, with the particular discomfort of someone who has looked clearly at what he was prepared to do, and doesn't like the shape of it. "We were wrong," he said, "about what this was, about what you were doing here." She thought about how to answer that. She thought about James Calloway and the word secure, and the way that what looked like nothing from the outside was sometimes the container for the most important thing. She thought about her father and the will language and the particular love of a man who could not say things directly, but could make sure they were in the document. "You were wrong about the Dovecote," she said. "You were not entirely wrong about me. I was in a very small life, and I needed something to change it. I just needed the kind of change you don't get handed. I needed the kind you have to walk across a frozen field for." The Christie's auction was held in New York on a Thursday in February. Nora was there, in the room, which Christie's had arranged for her at their suggestion, because the presence of the owner at the auction of a collection of this significance was, they said, appropriate and also good for the room. She sat in the fourth row with Delia on one side and Lily on the other. Lily in a dress that was the first new dress she had owned in 2 years, bought the day before in a store in Manhattan that was nothing like the stores in Staunton. Lily held her mother's hand throughout. The gemstones went first, lot by lot, the room filling with a bidding energy that Halverson had described in advance, but that was different to be inside of, the particular intensity of a space where people who had a great deal of money were competing for things they wanted very badly. The large Burmese sapphire opened at $8 million and finished at 14.2, a room record for a natural sapphire of its origin and grade. The largest ruby closed at $16 million. The fancy vivid yellow diamonds drew bidders on the phone from 3 continents. By the end of the gemstone session, the total was $161 million, above the high estimate. Nora sat with this number and looked at her daughter's face, which held the expression of someone who was watching a story end in exactly the way the story should end, but had not been certain until this moment that it would. The coin collection sold as a single lot in the second session, the catalog having generated significant pre-sale interest from American collectors and several European institutions that had been seeking to acquire major examples of Liberty Head coinage for decades. The bidding opened at $100 million and moved in increments that made Nora's vision briefly unreliable. It closed at $158 million, also above the high estimate, to a collector on the phone whose identity Christie's would not disclose. The room auctioneer announced the total, $319 million, the number she had been using since the parking lot of the shopping center in December, the number she had chosen because she believed it rather than hoped for it. She looked at Lily. Lily squeezed her hand. "You got the number right," Lily said. She had. She paid off the lease on the apartment on Decatur Street. She paid off the remaining credit card balances. She paid Delia's full invoice, which was significant, and paid it the day it arrived without looking at the total first, because the act of looking at the total first was a habit she was consciously releasing. She bought a house, not an estate, not a mansion, not a statement of anything. A house with 4 bedrooms and a yard, and a kitchen with a faucet that did not drip, though in a neighborhood in Staunton where Lily could walk to school, and there were trees on the street, and the light in the afternoons came through the windows at an angle that she had decided, the first time she saw it, was the right angle for the life she intended to live. She established a fund for the preservation of the Eastfield parcel and the Dovecote, which the University of Virginia architectural historians report had formally classified as a site of significant cultural and archaeological interest, the stone base being provisionally dated to the pre-Columbian period and warranting ongoing study. The fund would support the site's maintenance, the academic work, and the public interpretation of what had been found there and what it meant about the valley and the people who had moved through it across the centuries. She called Helen Price on the day the fund was announced and asked her to serve on its advisory board. Helen said she would need to think about it. She called back the following morning and said yes. She also called Warren Aldous, not in anger, not to declare anything, but because Delia had advised that clearing the air with the estate's attorney was a practical matter, and Nora had decided that practical matters should be handled practically. She told him that she intended to have no further dispute with her brothers over the collection or the parcel, that the legal record was clear, and that she hoped the estate's affairs could proceed without further friction. Aldous said he appreciated the call. She could tell that he meant it, which was the most she had expected. Gareth came to the new house in March on a Saturday, without calling first, which was how he had always operated, and which she had always found irritating, and which she found, now, simply characteristic. He stood on the porch with his hands in his coat pockets and said he wanted to see how she was doing. She made coffee. They sat in the kitchen with the good light coming through the windows and talked for 2 hours, not about the collection or the auction or the easement or the certified letter, but about their mother, about their father's final years, about Lily's school and Gareth's sons and Philip's daughter, who was starting college in the fall. They talked about the estate and what it meant to both of them, which was more than either of them had previously been able to say. When he left, thought he paused on the porch and looked at her in the way that the Calloway men looked at things when they meant something they could not say directly. "James would have liked you," he said. She thought about a careful man sealing a shaft in 1887. "He did like me," she said. "He just said it in lead and limestone." Gareth almost smiled. Almost. Then he walked to his truck and drove away. She stood on the porch of the house with the good light and the yard and the faucet that did not drip and thought about what it meant to inherit something. Not the money, which was real and important and had changed the practical shape of her life in ways she was still discovering. But the other thing, the recognition that she was part of a line of people who had understood, each in their own way, that the most valuable things were the ones you protected, not for yourself, but for whoever came after. James had protected it. Edgar had, perhaps, pointed toward it. And Nora had walked across a frozen field with her daughter in school boots and an old coat, and put her hand on the stone of a crumbling outbuilding, and listened when the stone had something to tell her. She looked out at the yard, where Lily was sitting in the new grass of early spring, reading, her book open across her knees in the particular way she held books when she was deep in them, as though they might otherwise escape. Lily was going to be all right. More than all right. She was going to have the kind of life that opened rather than closed, the kind that offered choices rather than constrained them. The kind that Nora had wanted for her since the moment she had first held her in a hospital room and understood what it meant to be responsible for something irreplaceable. That was what $319 million meant in the end. Not the number, the opening. The room that the number made for the things that actually mattered. And somewhere below the flagstone floor of a stone dovecote in the eastern field of the old Calloway estate, in a shaft lined with dry laid stone that was older than anyone knew and had been built to hold weight for a very long time. The earth was settling back into itself, having given up its kept thing, having done its long, patient work, having delivered into the hands of the person who came looking exactly what had been waiting for her. Nothing left in the dark now, but everything in the light where it belonged. The field was quiet. The stone was cold. The sky above the open roof was the particular blue of a Virginia morning in early spring, clear and exact, and full of the specific kind of promise that comes after a very long winter. Nora went inside to her daughter and her house and her new life. She had earned every inch of it. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.